Lady Liberty, the story behind an American icon. And there she is. And by the way, what other statues do we refer to as a she? We give it a gender, it's a personality. She's got a personality. There she is watching over the gateway to America. And what other foreign country, when you approach the capital city, or let's say the gateway, the most important city, the largest city, you're greeted by a figure like this, not representing military might or the power of the state, not threatening people who come under her glance, but a welcoming figure, sort of like, well, a welcoming mother of America, Lady Liberty. And she represents, of course, American values. But what she has represented and those values have changed over time. And that's one of the interesting things I discovered in researching my talk. My main source for this was a book called The Statue of Liberty, a Transatlantic Story by Edward Berenson. I'll wave it around here. If anybody wants the details, I can provide those to you. And the point of this story, like every historical story that I present, is that there are details that are fascinating. There are angles, there are contradictions, there are complications. And so even in this wonderful story of Lady Liberty, there's a dark side, there's a comical side, but ultimately I think you'll agree that it's a very inspiring story about America and what America means to those of us who are privileged to call the US home. So when we say Lady Liberty is an icon, a symbol, well, let me wake up my slides here. There's one thing Lady Liberty could represent: the federal government, especially at tax season. There's one of those pop-up tax consulting firms that you see all over the place every year in March and April, dressed up as Lady Liberty, out hawking services out in the along the highways and byways. Or you might think of this iconic representation of Lady Liberty in not New York City, but Las Vegas at the New York Hotel. What's interesting about this particular Lady Liberty is that in 2010, this fake statue provided the image on a US postage stamp, shown there on the right. The designer of the stamp found the image online from a stock photo service, paid $1,500 for it, didn't realize it was not of the actual statue, but of this replica in Las Vegas. But the stamp proved to be so popular, the Postal Service went ahead with the printing. They printed 5 billion of these stamps. And in 2018, a judge ordered the Postal Service to pay the artist of the statue in Las Vegas $3.5 million. That artist, that creator, said that his version of the statue was inspired by his mother-in-law. So in any event, there's a fake Statue of Liberty portrait on an official US postage stamp. Horrors, horrors. You'd be interested to know there are replicas of the Statue of Liberty in about 35 countries around the world, all countries that claim to pay homage to what, in their view, the statue represents. Perhaps freedom, liberty. There's a kind of a rough version of Lady Liberty in Israel on the right. And on the left is a fascinating statue on top a hotel in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. I served in Kosovo with the army in 2003. Imagine my surprise when I was driving down Bill Clinton Avenue in Pristina and saw Lady Liberty here perched on top of this hotel, Hotel Victory. And of course, the Bill Clinton connection. He was president when the US led the military intervention into Kosovo in 1999 to stop the ethnic cleansing of the Muslim population of Kosovo. So anyway, she pops up all over the world, and right up by Marysville along the Susquehanna River, of course, you can see Lady Liberty here. The last time I went by, she was decorated pink. I think it was for breast cancer awareness, but she adopts various colors and guises over the years. This particular statue, and I do hope you'll take a look at her next time you're up on either 15 through Marysville or Route 322 on the east side of the river, was originally created in 1986 by Gene Stilp. Some of you may know his name. He's a lawyer and a noted political activist in Harrisburg. And she was erected on an old bridge pier, originally made of plywood and Venetian blinds. The US Coast Guard, in its infinite wisdom, declared the statue, or the replica of the statue, was, quote, a threat to navigation. Well, eventually, a windstorm took out the original Lady Liberty in 1992, and Dauphin Borough mounted a fundraising campaign, raised $25,000 to rebuild this statue. She's now larger, permanently constructed of wood, metal, and fiberglass. She's lashed onto that bridge pier with cables, so she's not going anywhere soon. And in case you're wondering, she stands now 25 feet tall. An amazing sight, a minor tourist attraction in the Harrisburg area, right out in the middle of the Susquehanna River. Well, let's get to the story proper of the Statue of Liberty, Lady Liberty. She resulted really from a remarkable confluence of genius and determination. 5 people in particular, I'm going to talk about 5 people who are honored now. This happens to be one of them, Gustav Eiffel. Those 5 individuals are honored with these fairly new bronze statues on Liberty Island, the island where Lady Liberty stands proudly. So let me start by introducing you to, first of all, the intellectual behind the Statue of Liberty, Edouard de La Boulaye, a 19th century French professor and politician. He was a noted liberal in France in the traditional sense of the term liberal. He loved American ideals. He was a great friend of American liberty. He was inspired by the support that the French gave to the American Revolution. And unlike the revolution in France, the revolution in America did not lead to anarchy, Napoleonic dictatorship, or continent-wide war. So he was, again, a great admirer of America. Also a friend of the anti-slavery movement in France. Of course, France abolished slavery in 1794, but at the time that La Boulaye was active in France, for much of that time, slavery was still the law in the US. And in 1865, La Boulaye decided to honor the French-American connection, and he wanted to find a public way to do this. And in the process, he also wanted to inspire the French people to perhaps exercise their freedom in response to the repressive emperor under whom the French were living in the 1850s and 1860s. So he has the idea and to do something to celebrate this idea of American liberty. And lo and behold, one evening at a dinner party, he meets this guy, Frederick Bartholdi, a French sculptor. And in 1865, the year that Lincoln was assassinated, Bartholdi had actually been involved in a campaign to create a commemorative medallion of Lincoln, which, I'm going to quote here, is dedicated to Lincoln, the honest man who abolished slavery, restored the Union, and saved the Republic without veiling the Statue of Liberty. So here in 1865, there's no notion of a Statue of Liberty. Bartholdi is already using that term in describing this medallion to the late President Lincoln. Well, Bartholdi was a sculptor, a man of great ambition. A few years earlier, he had said, "When I discover a grand enough subject, I will honor that subject by building the tallest statue in the world." And this arrogant pose here, he looks like just the kind of guy who could carry out that idea of his to create a huge, memorable statue. So we're in Bartholdi's mind now, thinking what might have inspired him or created the visual idea for what became the Statue of Liberty. He was not inspired by the painting on the left. That's the famous painting by Delacroix, the French artist, Liberty Leading the People to the Barricades, a painting about the revolution in France, the revolution of 1830, being led here by a half-naked radical with mobs of destructive activists. No, that was not his inspiration. His inspiration was more likely the painting on the right by Louis Janet entitled, now get this, entitled The Republic, France Illuminating the World, 1848 painting. You'll notice Liberty here represents progress, not violence. She's dressed in classic Greek garments, ancient Greek garments, so there's a invocation of the ideals of Athenian democracy. And this title of this particular painting, Illuminating the World, then became the official name of the Statue of Liberty, which is, as you know, or well, you know now, the official name of the statue is Liberty Enlightening the World. Here are two other antecedents that were probably rolling around in Bartholdi's mind in the 1860s. The one on the left is the Colossus of Rhodes, a huge bronze statue of the Greek sun god Helios. This was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, functioned as a guide and a lighthouse, perhaps, of some fashion at the Greek island of Rhodes. Long gone, of course. I think it vanished in an earthquake back in ancient days. On the right is an interesting statue too, or a model of a statue, an illustration. This was Bartholdi's idea for a statue at the entrance to the Suez Canal, which was built by the French, opened in 1869. And you'll notice obvious resemblances to what became the Statue of Liberty. This particular statue was never built, and it's modeled after a peasant woman of Egypt, an anonymous peasant woman, but obviously, again, visual ideas that will soon take shape in what we know as the Statue of Liberty. There it is, and you probably can't read, but at the bottom is the title, Liberty Enlightening the World. This is the actual patent drawing for the Bartholdi design, headed at the top, statue at the bottom, Liberty Enlightening the World. And he fashioned a simple, powerful form for his representation of liberty, although in France, it was rumored that the Statue of Liberty has the face of Bartholdi's mother and the body of his mistress. I'll leave that to your imagination. She's got a diadem on her crown, 7 spokes, representing the 7 continents of the world, or maybe the 7 seas. And by the way, I should note early on, Bartholdi did not intend for the Statue of Liberty to be green. She started turning green about 20 years after she was built as a result of the oxidation of her skin, which is copper. There were some calls at the time to paint the statue, turn it back to its original brown, but thankfully it was determined to keep her green, and actually the oxidized copper serves to protect her a bit from the weather. In 1871, Bartholdi took a model of his statue to the US, tried to sell the idea of the Americans acquiring this statue or accepting it as a gift from the French, but he had no luck. He blamed the Americans for being too obsessed with money. They have no imagination, no interest in 1871 in this statue, even as a freebie from France. But that's going to change in due course. So Bartholdi, ever the optimist, returns to France, but he doesn't find much interest among the French people in the statue either. The French, whom he intends to pay for the statue. He even has a scale model of the statue installed in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris in 1870. And that statue is still there. Imagine my surprise, my wife and I were in Paris a few years ago, and lo and behold, there's this miniature of the Statue of Liberty as a result of Bartholdi's initial promotional efforts. Then 1871, the Emperor of France is deposed. There are new Republican ideas percolating among the French people. And the French also have an interest now in showing off their technical skill in building such a statue. They wanted to restore some sense of national confidence. They had recently been defeated by Germany in the Franco-Prussian War. And this seems like a good time now to pursue this project on the part of the French. So in 1875, La Boulaye, our intellectual friend, forms what was called the French-American Union. This was a group of about 400 prominent Frenchmen, cultured elite of society, including some descendants of the Marquis de Lafayette, who helped America in the Revolutionary War. This group takes upon itself the mission of raising money for the statue. The French people, through these efforts, were going to fund the statue, an estimated cost at the time of about $400,000. And the only provision for the US was to provide a place for it and a pedestal on which to put the statue. So a major fundraising campaign kicks off in 1878, involving just corporations, rich donors, and thousands of ordinary French citizens. The sale of trinkets, souvenirs also adds to the coffers. And finally, the French resort to a national lottery to raise the $400,000 at the time needed to pay for the construction of the statue. In 1878, construction begins at a workshop in Paris. So happens to be this was the same company that had previously worked on some major renovations at Notre Dame Cathedral. Now they're engaged in building this massive statue in Paris again, and she's to be taken apart, re-erected on site in America. They scale up from 1/16 scale models. 600 artisans work on the project, and you can see some of them there working on her arm, the arm that holds the tablet that says 1776. The way they made the statue is they created these wooden molds, which you can see there, and then on the surface of the molds, they hammer or rivet copper sheets, 3/32 of an inch thick, about the thickness of 2 pennies. These copper sheets, 300 in all, about 4 feet square each one, are to be mounted on this frame to be fashioned, and then the frame is removed. And then what do you do to erect the statue permanently? Well, the original idea was to put the statue, or to put these copper plates up on a pier made out of bricks. But the original engineer for the project died in 1879, and a new chief engineer is brought in, Gustave Eiffel, famous engineer, architect. Yes, he's the same Eiffel who 10 years later designs and builds the Eiffel Tower. Well, in 1879, he comes up with this novel idea for an internal structure made out of iron. It would allow the statue to flex in the wind in New York Harbor. And all of those copper sheets, those 400 copper sheets, are riveted onto this iron frame. So it's kind of an early concept to how skyscrapers are made without load-bearing walls. Again, think of copper sheets just hung on this iron frame. Meanwhile, Bartholdi returns to the US, still trying to promote interest in the US contribution to the project. And on the way over to the US, he takes along with him Liberty's arm and attached torch. And there you can see the arm and torch on display. One particular stop of this promotional trip was the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in Fairmount Park, 1876. And this arm and torch were exhibited as colossal arm. That's what they were called in the catalog, sometimes referred to as Bartholdi's electric light. So there they are, quite an object of fascination at the exhibition. This prompts an American fundraising body to form, to raise money. They held benefits, auctions, sold souvenirs and miniatures of the statue. And finally, in 1877, President Grant, on his last day in office, authorizes the U.S. to accept this gift from France, and his successor, President Hayes, chooses Bedloes Island, site of an unused military post in New York Harbor, as the place to put the statue. In 1877, 1878, Bartholdi is back in Paris to focus on the final work on the statue. And when at least the head is completed, it's put on display at another exposition. This was a World's Fair held in Paris in 1878. And for a small fee, you could go inside the head, walk up and look out through the eyes. One tourist who did that was Rudyard Kipling. He was in Paris at the time, the English writer and imperialist. He wrote about his experience. I ascended by a staircase to the dome of the skull and looked out through vacant eyeballs at the world beneath. I climbed up there often, and an elderly Frenchman said to me, "Now, you young Englishmen, you can say that you have looked through the eyes of liberty herself." That's a recollection from Rudyard Kipling. In 1884, construction is completed in Paris, and there you can see the statue looming over the district in Paris where she was built. And before she's taken apart for shipment to the US, Victor Hugo, the famous French novelist, he's 82 years old, on the last outing of his life, he sees the statue and he writes, "I have been to see Bartholdi's colossal statue for America. It is superb. When I saw the statue, I said, the sea bears witness to the union of two great peaceful lands." Well, but there's a problem. When the statue gets to America, difficulties. Where are you going to put it? Well, there is a pedestal being designed. Actually, it was being designed by the celebrity New York architect Richard Morris Hunt. This is the same Richard Morris Hunt you may know, who designed the fabulous Vanderbilt estate in Biltmore estate in North Carolina. He had designed this classical style pedestal made of reinforced concrete faced with granite. The pedestal actually is 3 feet taller than the statue itself. Work had begun on the pedestal on Bedloes Island, but there was not enough money in hand to finish the project. The US portion of the effort was to cost $300,000 at the time. And Americans were still very skeptical of this project. They were skeptical about France, the donor of the statue itself. Many Americans considered France to be a pagan, immoral society. The US was coming off the panic of 1873. There were economic difficulties. There were aesthetic objections to the statue. It was felt it would disfigure New York Harbor. And the most common objection to the statue was on religious grounds. It was felt the statue was idolatrous because, after all, Christ enlightens the world, not this pagan bronze goddess out in New York Harbor. The New York Times, at the time not a beacon of liberal thought, the New York Times editorialized, "No true patriot can countenance any such expenditures for bronze females in the present state of our finances." So the New York Times issues a thumbs down to efforts to raise money. Congress kills a federal appropriation for the statue. And the lack of interest, particularly among New Yorkers, is such that Philadelphia, Boston, and San Francisco all put in claims to be the home of the statue. Well, if you don't want it in New York, we'll take it gladly. And now the next figure in our story enters the picture, Joseph Pulitzer, the fundraiser. He takes up the cause of completing the statue's pedestal precisely. He was a self-made immigrant from Hungary, published a popular newspaper, the New York World, and he took to mocking the rich elite of New York City who would not contribute to this charitable endeavor. And so in 1888, he launches a mass appeal to raise the last bit of money, about the last third of the $300,000 needed. That's what they had come up short. And he launches a massive campaign to raise that last $100,000. As a publicity stunt, he prints the names of every donor, no matter how small, in his newspaper. This is a tactic, of course, still used extensively by fundraisers today. If you go to any classical music concert or go into the lobby of a museum, other venues, you'll see names of donors publicized for all the world to see. So he did that and ran a lot of letters from donors in his newspaper. Some of them were probably fake, but that's okay. That was part of a journalistic effort to encourage Americans to give the money needed to complete the pedestal. By the way, I have one poem here that was offered to the campaign. This was a handwritten poem, came into Joseph Pulitzer, and the rhyming is a little rough, so bear with me as I try to enunciate this poem. Should liberty come any day, 'tis April and soon will be May, and find not a place in the land whereupon she could solidly stand, you would deem it a sin if you had not chipped in. Well, let's have everyone chip in. There was one poem that was a bit more memorable that was associated with this fundraising campaign, and that was the poem, The New Colossus, written by Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus was born in New York of a German Jewish family. She never made much of her Jewish heritage until in the 1880s, she met Russian peasant Jews fleeing from the persecutions of the Tsar in Russia. And she became an activist not only on their behalf as a social worker, she began to write on Jewish settlement in Palestine, began to write about anti-Semitism, and she was inspired to give a voice to Lady Liberty. And she wrote her poem, The New Colossus, and donates it for a fundraising auction in 1883. And of course, the poem begins with those famous lines, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore," a direct reference to the new immigrants of the latter part of the 19th century coming to the US to escape poverty, persecution, and other social and political ills in their home country. And she offered the Lady Liberty as opening a golden door to these aspiring would-be immigrants. However, the statue itself, at least initially, had nothing to do with immigration. Many immigrants, it's true, saw the statue as a welcoming sight. You can see the image there on the right. But many Americans were wary about immigration. This new flood of immigrants in the 1880s, coming from places that had not previously sent immigrants to America, Italy, Eastern Europe. This new wave of immigrants, often blamed for labor unrest and potential to infiltrate radical ideas, Marxism and other notions into the American fabric. And on the left is an editorial cartoon from 1892. It shows the Statue of Liberty holding her nose, and at her feet it says, "The dregs of Europe." So again, America and Americans had conflicting views about immigration, and the statue was not necessarily intended to be a welcoming sign to immigrants. There was a plan to build an immigration center on Ellis Island, or excuse me, on Liberty Island, where the statue stands now. That was not approved, and eventually the immigrant reception station was placed on Ellis Island nearby. October 28th, 1886, the statue is finally unveiled. This famous painting by Edward Moran. 1 million people attended the ceremony. It was preceded by the first ticker tape parade ever in New York City, down through Lower Manhattan, as the traders on the New York Stock Exchange threw ticker tape out the windows. At the dedication, there were speeches on liberty, speeches on freedom, but no mention of immigration. It wasn't until 1903, after the anti-immigrant feeling in America receded a little bit, that Emma Lazarus's poem was actually placed on a bronze plaque inside the pedestal of the statue. And the statue, or excuse me, the pedestal or the plaque was not really noticed by the public until the 1930s, because some of you may know we went through another period of anti-immigrant feelings in the 1920s. And finally, in 1936, the Emma Lazarus poem was resurrected, as it were, brought anew to public attention. Now, during the dedication ceremony, even the freedom that was personified in the statue is relative. There were only 2 women present in the official dedication party. That happened to be the wife and granddaughter of 2 dignitaries. Female suffragists agitating for the right to vote circled around the island during the ceremony, shouting slogans from a chartered boat. And at this time, 1886, African Americans were beginning to see the gains of Reconstruction reversed with the rise of Jim Crow laws, lynchings in the South. And in the Cleveland Gazette, a Black-owned newspaper, the editor wrote, and I quote, "Shove the Bartholdi statue into the ocean until the liberty of this country is such as to make it possible for an industrious and inoffensive colored man in the South to earn a respectable living for himself and his family without being Ku Kluxed, perhaps murdered, his daughters and his wife outraged, his property destroyed. The idea of the, quote, liberty of this country enlightening the world, or even Patagonia, is ridiculous in the extreme." So even with her unveiling voices of skepticism about the ideals that she purportedly represented. Well, while some folks criticized the symbolism of the statue, others exploited it. The late 19th century saw the rise of mass advertising in America, and any number of companies would evoke the image of the statue to sell stuff. On the left is an ad for Elite Champagne, enlightening the world, it says. And on the right is a cartoon in Puck, the first successful humor magazine in America. And the statue is adorned with ads, just like cars that race for NASCAR today. She's plastered with ads, including ads for Zweig's Bock beer, Dr. Lugg's corn frightener down by her feet, and Sure Death cigarettes, mocking the commercial exploitation of the Statue of Liberty. With World War II, the statue is enlisted in a positive cause, patriotism, as she is the face of campaigns to sell the victory bonds to finance World War I. And in 1916, World War I came dangerously close to the statue when German agents blew up an ammunition dump on an island next to the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. The shockwave rattled windows all over lower Manhattan, weakened her arm, and her arm has been off limits ever since as a result of this damage in the run-up to the US involvement in World War I. As the 20th century proceeded, Lady Liberty is not only suffering from foreign assault, like those German agents, but also physical neglect and decay. She wasn't visited much by tourists, mostly ignored by the federal government. Until 1901, the statue was operated by the Lighthouse Board under the notion that it is sort of a lighthouse, or that was it could function as that, although she never had an actual burning torch. In 1901, the statue was transferred to the War Department because, after all, the island, Bledsoe's Island, was still the site of an old military base. Finally, in 1933, the National Park Service took over. FDR increased spending on maintenance and upkeep for the statue. Workers from the WPA repaired some of the worst corrosion And in 1937, 10 years after this aerial photograph was taken, the statue became a national monument, which paved the way for all of those ramshackle buildings to get cleared away. After World War II, visitor numbers increased and advertiser interest increased as well. Here are two of many commercials that you can see evoking the image of the Statue of Liberty. On the left is an airline promoting flights to India, and you can see the statue has gained a bindi, that red beauty mark, right on her forehead. This was a little bit controversial. And on the right, you can still see these commercials running all the time for Liberty Mutual insurance company with the statue in the background. By the way, these commercials are filmed from the New Jersey side of the harbor. The statue is much closer to New Jersey. And in fact, New Yorkers, patriotic New Yorkers may not like to hear this, but the statue is actually located in New Jersey, not New York. More seriously, the statue has been invoked to represent the power of American values, an icon of American values. Who can forget the destruction of human civilization in the movie Planet of the Apes in 1968, when Charlton Heston discovered the remains of the Statue of Liberty poking up from the sand. We got a still from the movie there. And on the top right, a more somber mood after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. This editorial cartoon shows a despondent Lady Liberty with the smoke still rising from the remains of the Twin Towers in New York City. Another form of assault on Lady Liberty comes in the form of all the indignities heaped on the poor woman in the name of commercial or artistic license. So here you have a Barbie doll of the statue, a menorah, and Miss Piggy with a convenient illuminated torch. There, all of these for sale on the internet or in one of those many souvenir shops that you run into in New York City. But all of these indignities did not come close to matching the real damage that was being inflicted on the statue by the passage of time. Wind, salt spray were taking their toll. Cracks in the statue appeared, corrosion, and she was becoming, frankly, a bit unstable, even dangerous to be around. In 1982, major restoration was called for, and President Reagan recruited Lee Iacocca, the CEO of Chrysler, to head up the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation to raise money to restore Lady Liberty back to fine working order. As with the original construction of the pedestal, millions of Americans contributed money to this effort, as well as, of course, large corporations seeking to be associated with a worthy cause. The statue was closed to the public from 1984 to 1986. And during that time, the world's largest freestanding scaffold was built around her. Artisans were imported from France to rebuild her flame, to add gilding to the flame, to replace the support system underneath her skin. They installed a dual stairway, an emergency elevator, and special lighting. So for the first time, the torch would actually be brightly illuminated. On July 4th, 1986, the statue was reopened to the public. And there down at the bottom, you can see in her crown, Nancy Reagan waving out one of the windows in the crown. In the background, in the main photograph, you can see fireworks. That was the largest fireworks display in US history. 40,000 fireworks fired from 42 barges out in the harbor. As part of the commemorative events, reopening events, 16,000 immigrants were naturalized via satellite. And the closing event for this extravaganza was held in Giant Stadium with a cast of 12,000 performers, including 200 Elvis impersonators. Pop culture at its finest. After 9/11, The statue was closed for security upgrades, then underwent several other closures for renovations, repairs. Finally, July 4th, 2013, she opens, we hope for good. And there's part of the crowd on opening day. And the latest addition to the island, which now, by the way, has been renamed from Bledsoe's Island to Liberty Island, very appropriate. So now the latest addition on Liberty Island is the Statue of Liberty Museum. Opened in May of 2019, including artifacts, exhibits, and you can see there on the left, the original 16-foot high torch, which originally rested in a small museum out of the way in the pedestal of the statue. So after 130 plus years, Lady Liberty is still standing, tall and dignified, with an enduring meaning for Americans, especially those who, like my own grandfather, came here, passed through her welcoming gaze, and built a new life in America, a life of freedom, opportunity, and hope. And so as we approach the 4th of July, it's a good time to reflect on the statue and what it means for America and for Americans. And who better to enunciate that than one of our most famous musical immigrants, Irving Berlin, who set the words of Emma Lazarus's poem to music in an otherwise forgettable musical called Miss Liberty in 1949. And it's significant that Irving Berlin himself came to America from Russia. He was 5 years old, and he passed under the Statue of Liberty, under the welcoming gaze of Lady Liberty in 1893, when his family brought him here, seeking, as so many others before and since, a little bit of the American dream. So I'll close with this image and a bit of that music from Irving Berlin. Of course, immigrants now more likely arrive by plane. Not very many, if any, enter through New York Harbor on a boat. But she's still there figuratively to welcome all those who come to America. And just sit back, and as I play this tune, you can experience a moment of patriotic sentiment here as we approach the 4th of July.